Since April, a 25% tariff on imported cars and auto parts has driven up costs for manufacturers and consumers alike. Automakers like GM and Stellantis are facing billions in added expenses, with the average price of an imported car projected to rise by nearly $5,000. Industry analysts say the tariffs could cost U.S. automakers over $100 billion this year alone. Some companies are absorbing the cost, at least for now, while others are rethinking supply chains or pausing imports altogether. Joining us to break it all down is David Gantz, the Will Clayton Fellow in Trade and International Economics at Rice University's Baker Institute. David, welcome to Hello Houston. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And if you would like to join the conversation or have a question for David, you can give us a call or send us a text, 713-440-8870. David, what auto manufacturers is this affecting the most that you can tell from right now?
I think it affects all those who sell cars to the United States, whether they're made in Mexico or Canada or a foreign country. China is the only manufacturer that's essentially barred from the U.S. market. So you mentioned in your intro the billions of dollars of costs that have already been incurred by Stellantis, that's used to be Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford, because there really isn't any automobile product sold in the U.S. that isn't affected by tariffs. Typically, about 8 out of the 16 million cars sold in a normal year, about 8 million are assembled in the U.S., about 4 million in Mexico and Canada, and the other 4 in foreign countries, mostly Germany, Korea, and Japan. But those that are coming in assembled from foreign countries, if they're coming from Japan or Korea or the EU, pay a 15% duty. Those that are coming from Mexico or Canada currently pay a 25% duty, although there's a credit for parts and components that are made in the USA. But it also applies to a car that's made in the US. For example, in Arlington, Texas, General Motors makes its large SUV Tahoes and vehicles of that size. But only about a third of the production value of one of those cars is U.S. The rest of it comes from Mexico or Canada, or in some cases from South Korea. So I think your estimate of the increased prices is probably pretty accurate. I've heard numbers ranging from 2,000 or 3,000 to maybe 12 or 15 for the really large SUVs and small trucks. And this is a huge change because up until recently, a car or an SUV, not a truck, but a car or an SUV only paid a duty of about 2.5%. And now, of course, it's increased by a great amount. So I think it's going, ultimately, it not only affects consumers, people like you and me who want to buy a new car, but it affects the number of cars that will be made in the U.S. because as prices go up, fewer Americans have the ability to take out a new car loan or pay the increased prices. And because American car makers have a double whammy, they're paying new high duties on parts and components, but they're also paying much higher costs for steel and aluminum and copper. U.S. auto production will become unproductive, which means that exports will probably decline as well.
But given the information that you just told us, have some of these U.S. manufacturers positioned themselves domestically better than others? And which ones would you say are the ones that have done that?
Well, I'm not sure it's been a lot of positioning. There have been a few changes. Ford, I think, assembles more of its vehicles in the U.S. Than either Chrysler, Stellantis, or General Motors, both of whom heavily dependent on Mexico and also depend on Canada, and again, in the case of GM, on South Korea. So they're probably a bit better off. Some factories that GM has have excess capacity, so they can easily move a few tens of thousands of vehicles production to the U.S. and employ a few more people. But for most companies, if they decide that they are going to increase their factory output in the U.S., it's going to take 2 or 3 years before they can actually do that. Honda's doing this with their Civic, but they say it won't be ready for additional production until 2027. So in the short term, the manufacturers have basically two choices. They can either absorb the costs, which many of them are doing up to now, but this won't last forever, or they can increase the prices that they're charging to their customers. Redoing the supply lines is potentially possible, but it takes a long time. And since Mr. Trump has imposed tariffs on almost everything coming from almost every country, there's a question of where are you going to move your sourcing where you're actually going to save a significant amount of money. So it puts the auto industry, whether domestically owned or foreign owned, in a very difficult position.
Mr. Gantz, I have a question. If all this continues and the prices go up and they can't absorb anymore, the financial advisors have always said if you can buy a really good car that's just a couple of years old, that somebody else has taken the hit on as they drove it off the lot new, you're in better shape. So would this would certainly increase the used car market, or would it? Would the used car market say, yeah, everybody wants a used car, so we're just going to make it more expensive?
My guess is that many Americans will say, I don't want to buy I don't want to buy a new car. I believe the reports that you're quoting that a 2 or 3 or 4 year old used car, maybe one coming off a lease, is a better deal. The thing is, the used car and the new car markets are related. If new car prices go up, good used cars will go up in price as well. So you will save something.
Yeah.
But you may not save as much as you would have a year ago. Plus, the interest rates on loans for used cars tends to be a point or two higher than for new cars. So the savings may not be as great as some people would hope.
And I'm just assuming leasing a car would probably have the same increase.
I think overall, leasing a car basically means you don't have to have a big down payment, and you may get smaller payments. Typically, you put up $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 up front, and then you make monthly payments, which are smaller than they would be if you took out a loan for 3 or 4 years. But at the point where the lease is up, let's say after 3 years, everything's gone. You don't get anything back.
Right.
Now, David, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
I was going to say, does the Trump administration plan to maintain these tariffs or modify them? Are lobbyists pushing for reduction or outright removal? Because we have seen him go back and forth on certain tariffs.
If you can figure out what the Trump administration is doing, you're doing a lot better than I am.
Touche, David. Touche.
My sense is that the current auto tariffs, except maybe for Mexico and Canada, and I think both countries are trying to negotiate them down to the 15% level so they're competitive with the Europeans and Korea and Japan. My sense is that these tariffs are going to be around for a long time. There may be some adjustments, but I think the auto industry worldwide has probably figured out by now that despite the efforts of its lobbyists, Mr. Trump simply isn't going to budge. I mean, the idea of having more cars sold in the U.S., made in the U.S., goes back to his first administration and his negotiation of the USMCA. And what he's doing now is putting a lot more pressure on companies that want to sell cars in the U.S., which is pretty much everybody, to produce more of them, or at least assemble more of them in the U.S., and to source more of the parts and components in the U.S. And to some extent, I think he will be successful. But there's a lot of pain for the auto companies, and there's a lot of pain for us as consumers.
And so when we look at the Trump administration's intent of bringing back that manufacturing, will these auto companies be able to actually do that? I mean, you mentioned a 2 to 4 year, looking at Honda, 2 to 4 year type timeline. It seems like it might take a lot longer than 2 to 4 years.
I think you're quite right. And obviously, before an auto company, whether it's domestic or foreign, and keep in mind, we have more than a dozen foreign auto companies that already produce substantial numbers of cars in the U.S. I think for many of these companies, there's a real decision. Do we put hundreds of millions or billions of dollars into establishing or expanding our factory operations in the U.S., money that needs a 10, 15, 20-year payout, or do we just sort of try to put things together as best we can and hope that these tariffs will go away in, let's say, in 2029? I'm not an optimist on those issues. So I think there's some, as I say, I think there's some short-term issues. I mean, Chevy, for example, makes the Silverado and the GMC equivalent. There are about 1 million sold a year. Half of them typically are made in the U.S. Half of them are assembled a third in Mexico and the rest in Canada. They've already said we're going to move 50,000 units from Mexico, presumably to the U.S. They can do that because their factories are not operating capacity. And GM, if my numbers are correct, says that we can do that by hiring another 200 employees, assuming we can find them. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really have a big impact at this stage on employment in the auto industry, but it's going to have a big impact because even if they do that, they are still bringing in parts and components from other countries that are subject to high duties if they're not made in the United States.
All right.
In the longer term, if everybody's convinced that this is what the real world is going to look like, I think many of the companies who already manufacture in the U.S. particularly will expand their production.
All right, we're talking to David Gantz about the tariffs and automobiles. If you'd like to join the conversation, give us a ring, 713-440-8870. We have a couple of YouTube comments that I want to get to, but I have a question I want to ask, and it's going to really show my ignorance. If, in order not to have any tariffs, does an automobile or truck have to be completely made in the United States? Or is there a percentage?
Prior to the new Trump tariffs, if your auto or SUV, small trucks are different, but if your auto and SUV was made in Canada or in Mexico, and at least 75% of the parts and components were sourced in North America, not necessarily the U.S. and North America, and the steel and aluminum was from North American sources, and your labor costs in 40 or 45% of the production value were at least $16 an hour, which obviously cuts out Mexico. The vehicles came in duty free instead of paying 2.5% duties.
So that was that part of NAFTA?
It was initially part of NAFTA, but it was changed substantially in USMCA in 2018. The regional content was increased from 62.5% to 75%, and some of the other, and the $16 an hour minimum there was also added. The idea was then, as it is now, to get more production of vehicles and vehicle parts in the U.S. It's just getting much tighter today.
Well, one comment from my British computer guy is, I think we've discussed, dealers regardless are going to use the tariffs to increase the pricing and use it as an excuse to get more out of the consumers, and used prices will go up for sure. Do you think that's true? That they would just say, oh.
Well, certainly, from what I can see, there hasn't been any evidence of that. Now, obviously, if GM or Ford or whoever, Toyota, increase the prices they charge to the dealers are going to increase their prices as well. Will some dealers who are independent of the big auto producers decide to try to gouge the public? It's always possible. Yeah. But I suspect you won't see very much of that because typically auto buyers tend to shop around much more than they used to, and it's much easier with the internet sites. So I think if one GM dealer in Houston, for example, tries to add an extra few $1,000s to a particular vehicle, your Houston colleagues, citizens, have probably, 4, 5, 6 other GM dealerships where they can shop around and try to get a better deal. So I think it's very hard for the companies to do that, for the dealers to do this.
And 95% of consumers just care about the monthly. How much is this going to cost me a month? And car dealers are very good at being creative about trying to hit your target. If you're $350 a month and that's all you can afford to pay, they'll extend the payments. They'll try to give you a break. They'll ask for your bank account and take it out monthly from your bank account. They'll come up with ways, I think, to meet the consumer if they can.
I think that's true, and the key is if they can. It's not the price; it's just the monthly payment. We've already gone to 6, 7, 8 year payments systems to reduce the monthly prices. I think it's hard for dealers to do this, partly because the interest rates are still fairly high. You're probably looking at well over 6%, maybe 7%.
Trump was screaming about that today. Trump was screaming about that today, the interest rates.
Yeah, well, he doesn't yet control the banks, but yes, basically they all tend to look at what the Fed rates are. Fed is supposedly going to lower the rates by 1/4% sometime this month, but I don't think that's going to have a huge impact on the cost of auto loans or home loans for that matter. They may come down a little bit, but will they come down enough to offset the additional costs that you're trying to finance?
Now, David, you were quoted in the AP back in March that the tariffs posed an existential threat to North American auto manufacturers. 6 months-ish later, does this still hold true?
Yeah, I think it's clear. I mean, the biggest threat, of course, is to Mexico and Canada if a lot of factories are closed and people are laid off. But we've already seen reports. I don't remember the numbers, but all three of the majors, Stellantis, Ford, and General Motors, have reported multi-billion-dollar losses for the first half of the year. So I think that's a big, very big hit for a business, particularly the GM and Ford, which typically is quite profitable. And I don't see how it's going to get better. I don't believe that they will be able to hold prices down and absorb all the costs eventually. I think you'll see car prices coming up substantially in the next few months and next year. But obviously those decisions are made by management and boards of directors. So I don't know what companies will do, but I guess they will all have to get out of the situation where their profits are so far down.
Do you think that the consumer will just pause on purchasing cars altogether?
Well, it's been interesting because as the tariffs were promised but not fully implemented, or as the major manufacturers were exhausting 60, 90-day inventories, there's been a huge rush to try to get in before the new cars come in that are going to have higher prices. So I suspect the market has been, I think, fairly stable up until at least through August. But the question is if and when the big producers start raising their prices, will it hold? And it adds to interest rates. Many people, I think, these days are a little bit uneasy about their jobs and their future employment. So it just adds one very big factor to somebody's decision to say, well, I'll keep my current vehicle for another year or two, or I'll go try to find a decent price on a good used car rather than buying a new SUV or a new small truck.
David Gantz is the Will Clayton Fellow in Trade and International Economics at Rice University's Baker Institute. David, thank you so much for joining us today on Hello Houston.
My pleasure. Anytime.